Democrats called diplomats as their first two witnesses. And almost immediately, something we had not heard before, a phone call between President Trump and Gordon Sondland, the U.S. ambassador to the European Union.
Following the call with President Trump, the member of my staff asked Ambassador Sondland what President Trump thought about Ukraine. Ambassador Sondland responded that President Trump cares more about the investigations of Biden, which Giuliani was pressing for.
That's William Taylor, the former U.S. ambassador to the Ukraine. He and George Kent testified today to what they perceived as President Trump pressuring Ukraine's new president to investigate Joe Biden's son and withholding military aid at first from Ukraine. But Republican John Ratcliffe from Rockwall argued there is no evidence that Trump has committed a crime.
What did President Zelensky actually do to get the aid? The answer is nothing. He did nothing. He didn't open any investigations. He didn't call Attorney General Bill Barr. He didn't do any of the things that House Democrats say that he was being forced and coerced and threatened to do.
Democrats have yet to officially indict Trump on any charge. Today's testimony is only part of the public evidence that Congress is likely to eventually consider. In Dallas, I'm Jason Whiteley.
And testimony continues on Friday. We will be streaming it live on WFAA.com.